Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service on this Friday, May 19th, 2023. And if you already haven't heard, I have a very important change notice to share with you about the Alaska Weather Show. The last TV broadcast of Alaska weather, at least in the traditional sense, over the airwaves as supported by Alaska Public Media, will be on Saturday, June 30th, 2023. Starting on July 1st, the National Weather Service will provide a modified web-based version of the program on a new YouTube channel. And we will be moving on YouTube from @AKwx TV to @NWS Alaska. And if you'd like to sign up with this new YouTube channel at this point, you can, and that content will be provided again starting on July 1st. We are now in the middle of, or I should say, in a public comment period just opened, and it runs through July 30th. So if you have any concerns, you may send your comments to nws.service-change-comments@noaa.gov. And we certainly also would like to hear some important memories from the past when you have viewed this show. Please send any additional questions to carrie.haisley@noaa.gov and donald.moore@noaa.gov. And as I always mention, if you'd like additional weather information on top of what is provided in this broadcast, you can go to weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's online presence. It'll bring you to a map of the continental U.S. You point and click anywhere on this map. It'll pull up a forecast with any relevant watches, warnings, or advisories for anywhere in the country. Of note, this Friday afternoon, these gray areas, northern Rockies down into eastern Colorado, even into southeast Wisconsin, are the result of air quality alerts from smoke from the wildfires, the unusually early fire season in Western Canada, Alberta, British Columbia. The smoke from those fires have been transported by the winds aloft into areas of the continental U.S. Here in Alaska, though, big news continues to be river breakup continuing. It is underway with ice jam and snowmelt flooding occurring. We have flood warnings at Buckland, Kobuk, and Kwethluk as a result of ice jams on the Buckland River, the Kobuk River, and the Kuskokwim River. We also have red flag warnings in effect through late this Friday evening in the east central interior due to dry conditions, warm temperatures, and gusty winds. Cooler weekend on tap with some scattered light showers in the Panhandle. This past week, the Panhandle had temperatures in the 70s and 80s, but have since cooled down to more typical temperatures now for this time of year. Look at this aerial shot taken early this Friday morning of the ice jam flooding at Buckland. There are a couple of large ice jams above and below town, and about 80% of the structures have been affected by water coming up to, at the very least, the base of them there in the town and community of Buckland. We also have a flood warning for ice jams in the vicinity of Kwethluk there on the Kuskokwim River upstream from Bethel. Mostly cloudy skies this Friday afternoon, 54 degrees, and then Plowalk had a temperature, high temperature, state's high temperature yesterday, Thursday afternoon, 86 degrees. This Friday afternoon, mostly cloudy, only 61 as of 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Here are the current advisories, warnings, watches. We have the red flag warnings here for the central eastern interior until 10 p.m. this Friday evening due to critical fire weather conditions, meaning warm temperatures, breezy conditions, and low humidities down around 25%, causing very high fire danger in this area. We also have a flood watch up here for the Yukon Flats area as a result of a big push of water coming down out of Canada through the Yukon, through the Porcupine River. And we also have flood watches here in the central portion of the Yukon River around Galena, including Ruby and areas up upstream. This region here has the potential yet for ice jam flooding because the primary area of ice jams is now moving through the middle Yukon, and then we have down here in the lower Kuskokwim area and Delta a flood watch for the potential for ice jams. We have the flood warning in effect there for Kwethluk. Otherwise, this area will continue to have the potential for ice jams to form and cause flooding here going into the early weekend. We also have the flood warnings here again at Buckland, and then also newly issued for Kobuk there on the Kobuk River just east of Ambler. And then we still have flood advisories around Glen Allen on the Copper River as a result of snowmelt flooding. Water levels remain high there with some minor flooding continuing to be reported. And here again kind of gives you a sense of the river breakup map. Here is the area, Upper Yukon, Porcupine River for snowmelt flooding potential, a flood watch there. This area is the flood watch on the Middle Yukon River for the ice jams that could potentially form on this stretch of the river. And then the lower Kuskokwim River has a flood watch in effect here through the early weekend. And again, these will likely be updated depending on exactly how these ice jams move about. Here's the overall trend. With the river breakup, we're seeing the breakup progress downstream, and so the lower Yukon has yet to break up. This is the next area. So if you live here down along the lower Yukon, take precautions. You want to make sure you move and safeguard property such as vehicles and things before high water and ice breaks up. Have extra food, batteries, and medical supplies ready in case they do get cut off from flooding. Know your community safety plan and where the emergency shelter locations are, and then stay out of those floodwaters and ice flows once they develop. Quick check of fire danger, reason why we have the red flag warnings here in the central, east, central interior. Into the day tomorrow, even on Saturday, we do anticipate very high fire danger on the north side of the Alaska Range up through the Tanana Valley, and also especially there up along the Yukon Flats. Satellite imagery this Friday afternoon shows a couple of areas. We have a low pressure that's coming up out of the North Pacific. There's a circulation, and that's going to pull back toward the Alaska Peninsula by Saturday afternoon. Broad ridge of warm high pressure extends from western Canada. The axis goes right up through central mainland and then out over the northern portion of the Bering, where the ridge here is a bit weaker. But this ridge has given, at least through much of the early and midweek, really brought the Panhandle a taste of unusually warm weather so early in the season. Here comes the low pulling back up toward the north and northwest. By late tonight, Saturday morning, it's going to be located just south of the southern portion of the Alaska Peninsula. We'll have a weak trough lingering across just north of the Alaska Range with ridging. So this trough here is what we call more of a thermal trough, the result of the warm ridge of high pressure in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere, and that trough will linger but have a few more scattered showers along it as we go through the weekend. Meanwhile, another low is going to come up in a similar fashion out of the North Pacific and kind of pull itself across the Alaska Peninsula and eventually up toward Bristol Bay, Nunavik Island as we go into early next week. Temperatures, though, relatively mild, 40s for lows in the Panhandle, generally above 40 in the 40s here across much of South Central. Temperatures Saturday afternoon, still some clouds and some scattered light showers there in the Panhandle. Readings could still make or break 60, say at Talkeetna, Palmer, on over toward Glen Allen. Cooler toward the coast, upper 40s, and then again temperatures above freezing across the region. Sunday morning and then Sunday afternoon, not quite as warm in South Central, 50s to near 60, and a similar story in the Panhandle, 50s to near 60. Notice though along the Yukon River, temperatures are going to stay above freezing in the middle upper Yukon, so that'll keep the snowmelt going. Along the north slope, Brooks Range and Arctic coast, temperatures stay below freezing. So this area here, the northern rivers along the north slope, will be the last to break up, and it's also delaying the breakup here in areas of the Seward Peninsula and the lower Yukon. But temperatures Saturday afternoon could still be back up in the 70s at Fairbanks, Fort Yukon, so it'll and even 76 there at Eagle. And again, temperatures stay above freezing along the Yukon River Valley, but still below freezing the far northwestern portion of the Seward on up across the spine of the Brooks Range and the North Slope. And temperatures Sunday maybe a few degrees cooler, a few more clouds around, but still some lower 70s there, especially Yukon Flats on over toward the Alcan border. And across the areas of the southwest, temperatures in the 50s to 60s to facilitate that snow melt. Sunday morning above freezing lower Kuskokwim and Yukon deltas with readings generally in the 50s, a few near 60s. Temperature, as we go up here toward the end of the month, May 25th through the 29th, temperatures will average maybe a little above normal in the northeastern half of the mainland, a bit below normal still across the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, lower Kenai Peninsula, and then precipitation could average a bit above normal, especially across the southeastern third or so of the mainland, including Anchorage up toward Fairbanks, Northway along the Alcan border, and a little bit above so there in parts of the Panhandle, and then back toward the Brooks Range and the west side of the state.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Well, let's look now at your aviation weather if you have a flight plan for this weekend. The main weather features we're watching: large ridge of high pressure still over areas of Canada and extending out through the central mainland out into the Bering. It has weakened here, at least through the mainland and out over the western Bering, but there is warmer air along this axis. Temperatures in the 70s and 80s that occurred in the Panhandle have cooled off because of cloud cover and showers. And then we're going to watch a series of low pressures that are going to be lifting northward out of the North Pacific, coming across the lower half of the Alaska Peninsula. We have one that'll be doing that Saturday, and then a couple of others following later in the weekend, and especially early next week. But IFR conditions possible there along the northern Gulf Coast, areas of the northwestern Arctic and Chukchi Sea coast down through the Bering Strait, and also back here through areas of the lower southeast quadrant of the Bering Sea. For Saturday afternoon, IFR conditions are more extensive with lower ceilings there along areas of the Arctic coast through the lower Chukchi Sea, Bering Strait, and then again west end of Norton Sound and out over the Bering through St. Paul and down to especially north side there of the eastern Aleutians. Sunday, still IFR there along areas of the North Slope and Arctic coast, back here through the Bering Strait, and also again the western areas of southwest corner, I should say, of the Gulf, and then Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula and areas along Kodiak Island. For Sunday afternoon, we anticipate IFR to be confined to the far north, up areas along the Beaufort Sea, Chukchi Sea, down through the Bering Strait, and then out over a good portion of the central Bering Sea down into especially the central Aleutians. VFR conditions across much of northwest Canada in through the mainland interior. So pass conditions here, Anatuvik Pass and both Adigan Pass should see VFR conditions prevail on Saturday. Further south and west, Lake Clark and Merrill holding on to MVFR conditions as the result there of a little moisture there in the southwestern end of the Alaska range. Rainy Pass, MVFR trying to become VFR. Generally VFR conditions though, central Alaska range eastward through Isabel and Mentasta passes. And then as we drop further south across the Copper River Basin, generally VFR conditions are anticipated there. And a split at Portage Pass, the eastern half through the east entrance into Prince William Sound, MVFR conditions Saturday, but VFR will prevail to the west. And then finally, in the far northern Panhandle, Chilkoot and White, MVFR to start Saturday morning, giving way to VFR conditions, especially as we get through the noontime and afternoon hours. Freezing levels aloft. Of most important note, notice these higher freezing levels. Big ridge of high pressure still out here in Canada, and that ridge extends to a weaker extent back across the central mainland into the northern Bering. This is the ridge axis. It's the dome of warmer air in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere. Further south, we see the effects of low pressure generally residing here, lower Chukchi Sea, but we're going to have a low lift out of the North Pacific and move on up, impacting areas of Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula Saturday. We could see some isolated to considerable moderate icing potential, but above 10 and 12,000 feet because the air mass has been a bit warmer and the cloud heights higher here along parts Pacific side there of the Alaska Peninsula and especially south and east side of Kodiak Island. A few isolated scattered showers across areas of the southwest interior. We could see above 10,000 feet there. So at jet stream level, we find a low pressure circulation just south of the Alaska Peninsula, another one back toward the central western Aleutians. General high pressure here, eastern Russia, Gulf of Anadyr extending here into central Canada, the ridge axis, and that's the dome of warmer air aloft. At 9,000 feet, we find still that ridge of high pressure running from the Bering Sea across the central mainland, northwest Canada, with the low just south of the Alaska Peninsula. 3,000 feet, we do have some stronger winds, 40 to as high as 55 knots coming on in there just south of Kodiak Island into Bristol Bay, circulating counterclockwise circulation around that area of low pressure. So we do anticipate some areas of turbulence, moderate turbulence expected here over the southwest, especially Bristol Bay and at least the northern 2/3 of the Alaska Peninsula, primarily between the surface and 4,000 feet. It could be a bit higher in a few areas, maybe surface to 6,000 feet. And I wouldn't rule out even an isolated area of maybe isolated severe turbulence possible as well.
Why is plastic marine debris so common? We know there's trash in the ocean. Unfortunately, a lot of it is plastic. We find plastic everywhere, from the ocean floor to surface. The plastics are all shapes and sizes and all different types. We find plastics on beaches and also inside animals' stomachs or wrapped around their bodies. That's bad news for our ocean and the animals that live in it and near it. It's also bad news for us. A recent study from the University of Georgia estimated that 8 million metric tons of plastic trash enters the ocean every year. That's like putting 5 bags filled with plastic on every foot of coastline in the world. That's a lot of plastic in the ocean, and it's there because, well, we put it there. The 5 most common items found during the International Coastal Cleanup are plastic cigarette butts, food wrappers, plastic beverage bottles, plastic bottle caps, and plastic straws and drink stirrers. Notice anything in common with those? It's a lot of single-use, disposable plastic. It goes without saying, we produce too much waste. That waste ends up in the ocean when we litter or don't recycle. Plastic is an important part of our modern lives. We use it for a lot of good things, but we need to take responsibility for how much we use every day and where it goes when we're done with it. The 3 R's can help, and it's up to every single one of us to practice them. Reduce your use of disposable plastic. That's anything you use once and throw away. Just use less. Reuse disposable plastics when possible. A plastic bottle makes a great coin piggy bank or watering can. The possibilities are endless. Recycle anything that can be recycled so it stays out of landfills where trash can blow away. Ocean plastic is a huge problem that's only going to get worse. Unless we change our ways, we can do better for the ocean and for us. Why is plastic marine debris so common? We know there's trash in the ocean. Unfortunately, a lot of it is plastic. We find plastic everywhere, from the ocean floor to surface. The plastics are all shapes and sizes and all different types. We find plastics on beaches and also inside animals' stomachs or wrapped around their bodies. That's bad news for our ocean and the animals that live in it and near it. It's also bad news for us. A recent study from the University of Georgia estimated that 8 million metric tons of plastic trash enters the ocean every year. That's like putting 5 bags filled with plastic on every foot of coastline in the world. That's a lot of plastic in the ocean, and it's there because, well, we put it there. The 5 most common items found during the International Coastal Cleanup are plastic cigarette butts, food wrappers, plastic beverage bottles, plastic bottle caps, and plastic straws and drink stirrers. Notice anything in common with those? It's a lot of single-use, disposable plastic. It goes without saying, we produce too much waste. That waste ends up in the ocean when we litter or don't recycle. Plastic is an important part of our modern lives. We use it for a lot of good things, but we need to take responsibility for how much we use every day and where it goes when we're done with it. The 3 R's tips can help, and it's up to every single one of us to practice them. Reduce your use of disposable plastic. That's anything you use once and throw away. Just use less. Reuse disposable plastics when possible. A plastic bottle makes a great coin piggy bank or watering can. The possibilities are endless. Recycle anything that can be recycled so it stays out of landfills, where trash can blow away. Ocean plastic is a huge problem that's only going to get worse. Unless we change our ways, we can do better for the ocean and for us.
What is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch? Well, first, let's talk about what it's not. It's not a floating island of trash like a garbage dump or a landfill. It's also not the only patch. They exist all throughout the ocean, and the Pacific Garbage Patch just happens to be the most famous. Garbage patches are large areas of marine debris concentration that are formed by rotating ocean currents called gyres, kind of like big whirlpools that suck things in. A garbage patch is made up of tiny plastic pieces called microplastics that are less than 5 millimeters long. It's more like pepper flakes swirling in a soup than something you can skim off the surface. You might come across some larger items like plastic bottles, but it's possible to sail through a garbage patch and not see anything. And they're a big problem for the ocean and us. People often ask why we can't just scoop up all the marine debris in the ocean. And the answer is, unfortunately, it's just not that simple. The first challenge is the sheer size of these garbage patches. They're huge. They're constantly moving with ocean currents. And there's debris from the ocean surface all the way down to the sea floor. Not to mention all the marine life we would disrupt if we tried to just scoop up debris. So what can we do? Well, the ultimate solution is prevention. And we need to keep that as our highest priority. We can reduce, reuse, and recycle to keep trash out of the ocean in the first place. And we can participate in things like shoreline cleanups. It's a lot easier to deal with debris before it gets to the ocean. Because until we stop marine debris at the source, we'll just be cleaning it up forever.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back to the marine weather segment of our show. We start with the sea ice edge, and we're at that point now as we're getting about a month away from summer solstice. We're seeing the melting really starting to take place here, lower Chukchi Sea, and especially south of the Bering Strait up through the northern Bering Sea. It's been such a cold spring, but temperatures have moderated this past week. We've had a warm ridge of high pressure, mid-upper levels of the atmosphere has at least brought a decent moderation in temperatures, and river breakup is underway across the interior, so the ice will continue to retreat and melt off to the north. We see here out across the northern Bering out along the southwest coast, most of the ice shedding away there along the lower Yukon Delta, certainly as we get further south through Kuskokwim and down in certainly Bristol Bay. As far as our marine weather forecast goes here coming up for the Panhandle Saturday into Sunday, winds will initially be out of the northwest, 10 knots there, middle, lower channels, waves a couple of feet. Lynn Canal, 10-knot winds from the south, 2-foot waves, but we've had a front come in, bring in cooler temperatures compared to the really warm temperatures of the past week in the 70s, even some 80s. Winds along the outer coast, generally out of the west-northwest, 10 to 15 knots, waves running 5 to 6 feet within 15 nautical miles of shore. On Sunday, we expect south winds, middle and upper channels there from Stevens Passage on up through Lynn Canal. South winds 15 knots, waves running 2-3 feet. Northwest winds 15 knots there down through Ketchikan, Metlakatla, waves 3 feet. And then the outer coast, generally west winds at 15 to 20 knots and waves right around 6-7 feet. Across the northwestern Gulf, we're going to see winds picking up here at the entrance of Cook Inlet. East winds 30 knots ahead of a frontal system further south and west. Look for a southeast wind 10 knots, 2-foot waves in Prince William Sound. Easterly winds, Turnagain Arm, upper Cook Inlet with waves running 2 to 3 feet. For Sunday, variable winds 10 knots, waves only a couple of feet there within the open waters there. Prince William Sound's variable as you get south of Cordova, 10 knots, and winds come down out of the east at 10 knots there at the entrance of Cook Inlet with waves running maybe 5 feet. Strongest winds across the state this weekend, Saturday, will be ahead of a low pressure and frontal system that's going to be pulling up south of Sand Point, and we have easterly winds around Kodiak Island and east of Chicknick there at 35 to 40 knots. Waves as high as 12, 15 feet south and southeast of Kodiak Island. Out of Bristol Bay and on the north side of the peninsula, northeast winds to 30 knots and waves running generally around 5 feet. Winds will come down on Sunday across the region. East-northeast winds across Kodiak Island around 25 knots. Waves 6 to as high as 9 feet as you get offshore there of the east side of Kodiak Island. And then winds more out of the east-southeast, 15 to 20 knots. Waves running 3 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side and let's say maybe 3 to 5 feet on the Bering side. Across the Aleutians, winds relatively light. Look for northwest winds 20 knots across the eastern and western Aleutians, far western Aleutians, and variable around 10 knots there in the central Aleutians at Atka and Adak. Waves generally running 3 to 5 feet on the North Pacific side and 3 to maybe 6 feet on the Bering side. And winds relatively light and variable on Sunday, variable around 10 knots, a few spots here, northwesterly 15 knots, especially west of Nikolsky, and waves on the North Pacific side 3-4 feet and generally 3 to 4 feet on the Bering side. For the southwestern coast, east wind there across Bristol Bay on Saturday, waves a couple of feet. As we go up the coast, winds will be northeasterly out of Norton Sound and along the Yukon Delta at 15 knots, turning northerly to 20 knots there at St. Matthew with waves running 4 feet. On Sunday, generally an offshore flow coming in off the southwest coast, 25 knots out of Bristol and Kuskokwim Bays with waves running 2 to as high as 5 feet. Variable wind 10 knots there around St. Matthew, 3-foot waves, and then a southwest wind 10 knots into Norton Sound. And finally, looking at the Arctic coast, west winds 15 knots as we drop down through the lower Chukchi Sea, 10 to 15 knot winds out of the north, turning north-northeasterly around 15 knots through south of the Bering Strait, north side of St. Lawrence, and in through Norton Sound. And then on Sunday, winds will generally have a south to east component at 10 knots across the far northern Arctic coast. But south winds 10 to 15 knots, lower Chukchi Sea, and kind of a mix of southeast winds around 5 to 10 knots there off the west side of the Seward Peninsula and the north side of St. Lawrence Island.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.